So today we're talking about how to directly quote sources in MLA format. Well, let's begin by talking about what MLA format is. It's a style of citation used to write papers and to cite sources, and it stands for Modern Language Association. So in your high school career, the format you'll most likely be required to use is MLA. When you get to college, you'll be required to use a mixture of MLA and APA, which is another popular citation style. So why should we cite sources? Well, when you're writing a research paper, citing credible sources makes your arguments more believable because you are not necessarily a professional yet. You're a professional student, but that's not what people look for when they're looking for a credible source. So when you cite other credible experts, that makes your arguments more believable. If you're writing a paper about the zombie apocalypse, for example, having a direct quote from a well-known researcher who has a PhD would be much more impressive than supporting your point of view solely with your video game experiences. So one way to cite sources in MLA is to use direct quotations. It's one of the two different ways we're going to talk about. As the name implies, when directly quoting source material, you use quotations to indicate which words come from the source. So in this example, you can see that the red quotations surround the sentence 100 years ago, the average temperature of the earth was about 13.7 degrees Celsius. Today, it is closer to 14.4 degrees Celsius. So as a reader, I know that the person who wrote this research paper got those exact words from this source that they are citing. And we'll talk about internal citations, which is what that silver 11 is at the end of the sentence there. So anytime you take words directly from a source, you must put quotations around them. There are three parts to a direct quote. The first part that you must use is what is called a signal phrase. You have to introduce the quote with a phrase that tells where the information is coming from. So some examples, and you're not limited to these are just examples, are according to Mrs. Kruse, instructor at East Peoria Community High School, blah, 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 in the words of Mrs. Kruse, as Mrs. Kruse notes, or blah, 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 claims Mrs. Kruse. So you can see the signal phrase can go either before the direct quote or it can come after the direct quote, like that fourth example there. It says, note that commas follow or precede signal phrases, and they are in red to make it easy for you to see where the commas would go in relation to the signal phrase and the quote. The first time you directly quote information from a source in your essay, you must state the source's credibility. Tell readers why they should listen to this person or to this source. What makes them an expert? So if you quote Barack Obama, let's just pretend that someone doesn't know his credibility. You would say Barack Obama, President of the United States of America, blah, 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 and then continue on with your citation. Okay, the second part of a direct quote is the quotation marks. You have to put the words from the source in quotation marks. If you do not, it will be plagiarized. So an example, again, as you can see here, you have your signal phrase, Rodriguez and Belanca observe. Now we're going to assume that this is not the first time that this person has cited them in the paper, because if it was, we would need to know the credibility. Who are Rodriguez and Belanca? But anyway, there's your signal phrase, and then everything that is written in between the red quotation marks came from that source that Rodriguez and Belanca wrote. The third part to a direct quote is the in-text citation. So in MLA style, referring to the works of others in your text is done by using what is known as a parenthetical, because it's in parentheses, or internal citation. Internal because it's in the body of your essay. This method involves placing relevant source information in parentheses after a quote or a paraphrase. So, for example, human beings have been described by Kenneth Burke as symbol-using animals. Now, you're only putting the page number in the parentheses there because Kenneth Burke, the author, is stated in the signal phrase. Another example, human beings have been described as symbol-using animals. So in that example, Kenneth Burke is not stated in the signal phrase, so you have the author's last name and the page number in the in-text citation. So what goes in an internal parenthetical in-text citation? 3 names for the same thing. For MLA format, you are required to provide the author's last name and the page number of the source whenever that information is available. So, as an example, romantic poetry is characterized by the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. And then you have in red there, inside parentheses, Wordsworth 263. So Wordsworth is the author's last name, 263 is the page of the source it came from, and you can see the period is outside the last parentheses. Of course, exceptions to the rule exist, so we're going to go through a few of those. So what if the source has no page numbers? Many online sources do not have page numbers. So printer page numbers, like it'll say 1 of 3 in the top right hand or the bottom right hand corner, those don't count because not all printouts give the same page numbers. So if that's the only pagination that you can find, then it doesn't work. If a source has no page numbers, just use the author's last name in the parentheses. What if I use the author's name in the signal phrase? Well, we kind of already covered this, but in this case, you do not need to include the author's name in the internal citation. Just use the page number. So what if there's no page number? Again, you will not make one up, so you just won't have an internal citation. And this is an example of what that would look like. You have the A&E Network announced Friday it would resume filming Duck Dynasty with Phil Robertson and the rest of his family next spring, in a reversal of its decision last week to suspend him for comments he made about homosexuality. Then you have the signal phrase with the author's name, Todd Starnes of Fox News reports. So, since it's an online source with no page number, and since the author's last name is used in the signal phrase, you have no internal citation. Can an organization be the author? Yes. When the author is a corporation or an organization, name that author either in the signal phrase or in the parentheses. So the first example there shows naming it in the signal phrase. According to a 2001 survey of human resources managers by the American Management Association, blah, 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 blah. So American Management Association is the organization as the author. The second example, it does not include American Management Association in the signal phrase. Therefore, it has to be included as the author in the internal citation at the end of the sentence. What if there's no author? There's no individual, there's no organization. First of all, my answer would be do some detective work. Make sure there really is no author. Sometimes the author is just difficult to find. You might have to look on the home page. You might have to look under the contact information. You might have to dig a little bit deeper on the website. So don't just be lazy and assume that there's no author. However, if you really do your research and there's still no author, either use the complete title in a signal phrase, title of the article or the piece, or use a short form of the title in parentheses. So titles of books, magazines, newspapers, and websites, like we have discussed, are italicized. Titles of articles are put in quotation marks. So an example here at the bottom, automatically is in quotation marks because it is a shortened form of the title, and there are no page numbers because this particular online source does not have pages. Again, you can see the period follows the internal citation. So what if there are 2 or 3 authors? Because not all sources have just one author. For 2 or 3 authors, name the authors in a signal phrase, as in the following example, or include their last names in the parenthetical citation, like Kiza and Sanyu 2. 2 is the page number. Or you can put it in the signal phrase, Kiza and Sanyu note that employee monitoring is a dependable, capable, blah, 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 blah. And then at the end, you still have the to, the page number, in the internal citation. When 3 authors are named in the parentheses, separate the names with commas. So that would be, for example, Alton, comma, Davies, comma, and Rice, 56. If the source had no page number, then you would just omit that page number, leave it out. What if there are 4 or more authors? In this case, you include only the first author's name, followed by et al., which is Latin for and others, which makes sense. So in the example, Blaine, which is the first author's last name, et al., and others, 35 being the page number. It's just way too long if you were to list 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 authors in an internal citation. So what about indirect sources? Well, sometimes you may have to use an indirect source, which is a source cited inside another source. Because if you are reading credible research, they probably did their own research and cited other people. So for such indirect quotations, use quoted in to indicate the source you actually consulted. So for the example here, you have Ravitch argues that high schools are pressured to act as social service centers, and they don't do that well. So quoted in Weissman, 259. So in the signal phrase, Ravitch is a person who is actually being quoted, but Ravitch didn't write the article, so you still have to say the author of the article's last name in the parentheses, but you add the quoted in Weissman's article to let us know that Weissman did some research and Weissman cited Ravitch, who was a different author. So for other questions, which you are bound to come across, you need to make sure that you do your research and format correctly using MLA guidelines, the most recent format. So here are a couple websites that would help you out. The one that I always default to is Purdue's OWL Writing Lab, the MLA 2009 style guide. But there's one thing we still haven't talked about yet, which is long direct quotes. So for quotations that are more than 4 lines of text, not 4 sentences, but 4 actual lines of typing, place quotations in a freestanding block of text and omit or leave out the quotation marks. Start the quotation on a new line with the entire quote indented 1 inch from the left margin and make sure that you maintain double spacing. Your parenthetical citation should come after the closing punctuation mark, which is different than for a short direct quote, because for a short direct quote, your period comes after the internal citation. So let me show you an example of what that would look like. Here you have the text of what the person is actually writing. By the 1860s, the need for this knowledge was strong enough to affect education, blah, 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 blah. And then you have the signal phrase, which is the farmer's assistant, being a digest of all that relates to agriculture and the conducting of rural affairs, alphabetically arranged and adapted for the United States, colon. This is a long direct quote because it is more than 4 lines when it's typed out. So you can see it's indented from the left-hand margin, and you can see that the internal citation, which is just the page number, is after the period there, entitled to them period 92. And you can see it's all double spaced with no extra spacing. So when do you use long quotations? Well, luckily for you, you are writing a relatively short research paper, and you're only using long quotations if you are writing a long research paper. So if your research paper is between 1 to 3 pages, which is what yours will be, you should not use a long quotation. That means you do not have the option to use a direct quote that is longer than 4 lines. If you want to use the information that would be in a long quotation, you can paraphrase it, which we're going to talk about later. It means put it in your own words. Or you can paraphrase part of it and then put part of it in a direct quote so that the direct quote is not more than 4 typed lines. And that's everything that you need to know about directly quoting in MLA format. Again, if there was anything left out, which you might find exceptions, you need to consult the MLA style guide at Purdue's OWL Writing Lab and or ask your teacher.